Hi there, my name is Will and today I'm going to walk you through how to install Kestra on AWS using EC2, RDS and S3. Now the first step to getting this working is you're going to need to create an AWS account. If you've already done that, you should be presented with a console screen that looks a little bit like this. Once you've done that, we can now head over to EC2 to create our virtual machine where we're going to host Kestra. Now we're going to go to this launch instance button on the page, and here we're going to create a new server. Now I'm going to name my web server something simple such as Kestra AWS server. We're going to select Ubuntu for the operating system, and I'm going to use 22.04, but you can use a newer version if you would like. However, your mileage may vary for compatibility. Now we've selected the operating system, we now need to select our instance type. Now it's worth noting that Kestra requires a minimum of 4 GB of RAM, so we're going to need to upgrade from the T2 micro because this is not going to provide enough for us. We also need to have 2 vCPU as well, so T3 medium is normally pretty good for this. As you can see, we've got 2 vCPUs and 4 GB of RAM. So let's select that, and now we can move on to setting up our SSH keys. I'm going to click create a new pair. I'm going to select RSA and I'm going to call this Will AWS pair. And I'm going to use the PEM file for OpenSSH because I'm using Mac. But if you're on Windows, you might want to use PPK for PuTTY. Now, when I press create, we'll see that it's now downloaded that file, so we can use that a little bit later. Now, last thing to do here is our security group and the network settings. So under security groups, we're going to create a new one, and we're going to allow SSH traffic from our IP address, which is displayed on the screen. Now I'm going to blank that out, but yours should display here. Then I'm going to select allow HTTPS traffic from the internet, which means we'll be able to then access the instance with Kestra. Now we've done that, we can now press launch instance and we'll see that it's going to now spin up our virtual machine, and we can now SSH into it to then configure Kestra. I can now click on this ID at the top here to open up our instance, where we're going to see information we need to connect to it. Now the first thing we need to do to be able to SSH into our instance is give our key some permissions. So here I'm just giving it chmod 400, so when I do that, that should now work. Now after that, I can now SSH by doing ssh-i, the name of my key, which is will-aws-pair.pem, then Ubuntu and then the address of my machine. Now we can see it here on the right hand side, public IPv4 DNS. So I've pasted that in, and now when I press enter, we'll see that it's going to connect successfully to the instance. Now we've done this, we can install Kestra using Docker, but first, Docker is not installed, so we need to install Docker first. What I usually do is go to the Docker website, I add the ABT repository to it, then I install Docker doing that method. So I'm going to paste this in, let it install the packages it needs from that repository, and then I'm going to be able to install Dockers. Now I've done that, I can now install Docker using ABT, and once that's done, then we'll be able to test if it works. Now that we've done this, it will let me now run this Docker example where it's going to pull the hello world and test that it works. But there is a catch. Docker hasn't been added to the user group, which means that when we try and run our Docker Compose in a second, it won't work. So what we need to do is now head over to this guide where we're going to do sudo doc group add docker, like so. And we can see the group already exists, which is great. But then we're going to add our user to that group to make sure that we can then run our Docker Compose for Kestra in root. Now we've done that, we can use curl to now download the Docker Compose for Kestra using the command on the website. And now if I do ls, we'll see that Docker Compose is ready to go. And we can just double check that that is the one for Kestra, and we can see that this is exactly what I expected. So now we can do a Docker Compose up, and we'll see that I've just signed out and signed back in as this user to make sure those permissions are all set up correctly. Now I can run Docker Compose up, and we'll see it's going to start pulling those Docker images to our EC2 instance. While this happens, we can now make sure that our firewall is set up to allow Kestra to run on port 8080, otherwise we won't be able to access it. Now I'm going to go to our security group here, which we can access at the bottom of the instance information, and I'm going to add a new inbound rule here for the Kestra UI port. I'm going to add a new rule, this is going to be a custom TCP one, and I'm going to simply just say for port 8080, this is going to work on 0.0.0.0.0/0, so it will work on any IP address, and I'm just going to put Kestra UI port. So it's really clear what this is. Now, when I press save rules, we'll now be able to access Kestra at the address of our instance. Kestra is now up and running, so now let's go back to our instance and we'll be able to launch Kestra. So now if I go to our address and then go to port 8080, we'll see that Kestra has now spun up for the first time and we can now run a flow. So let me just create the example one, press that, press execute, and we can see that Kestra is now running, but it's running inside of EC2. Now, this works and you can continue to use this format going forward. The only difference you're going to want to do is instead of doing just docker compose up, you're going to want to do docker compose up -d to detach the container, so when you disconnect from SSH, the container will continue to run in the background. But if we have a look at that docker compose file again, we can see that there's a few things going on inside of it. We can see at the top here that there is a Postgres container that is running, which means at the moment the database is running directly inside of the EC2 instance, along with our internal storage where all of our outputs are stored and any files generated by Kestra. So what we can do is now break that into 3 parts. We can break our internal storage into S3. This should be cheaper in the long run because storage in S3 is generally a little bit cheaper than storage on the virtual machine itself. So this will allow us to be able to control that cost a little bit more, but also see those files a little bit easier. And then for the database, being able to run that inside of RDS just gives us a little bit more control over what's going on, but also allows us to keep it isolated from Kestra. We can have the VM turn off and on, but we won't have the database be impacted by this. Now what I'm going to do is get RDS set up so that we can get the Postgres bit inside of here removed, and we can then configure the Postgres data here to point at our RDS database. I'm going to search for RDS and select that. Once I'm on the dashboard, I'm going to click databases and create database. When we go in here, we're going to select Postgres SQL as Kestra works best with this. And then we're going to go down here and we're going to select the free tier of RDS. Now, again, you could change this depending on your scenario, such as the production one. Once I go down a little bit more, I'm going to name our database Kestra AWS DB, and we can then use that a little bit later. Next, I'm going to select the credential manager to be self-managed. Now we can actually simplify things a little bit here by, if we go back to AWS, which we can do by going here, I'm going to take the same password I had from Kestra and add rocks to the end, and then I'm going to paste that in here to my master password, and we're going to confirm that here too. What we can do now is scroll down to connectivity, where we're going to change this to connect to an EC2 compute resource, because that's what we want to achieve here. We're going to then select our AWS server that we already have running. We're now going to choose an existing subnet group, which is the default, and then we can also select the VPC security group, which is the launch wizard one. So once we've done all of that and we can see that we've got everything else set up, we can now click create and then connect this to Kestra. While that spins up, what we need to do now is go back to our EC2 instance and set up this database with the initial schema so that it works with Kestra. First of all, we need to install a Postgres SQL client. So let's do that and get that installing while the database sets up. Now, to be able to create the schema, we are waiting for this database to set up, because then we can get the endpoint and then put that in when we create the schema. So just give it a few minutes and then we'll be able to continue. Great. Our database is now set up and we now have an endpoint. So let me copy that endpoint. We can now go back to our terminal and finish connecting and creating that schema. So now I can press enter here. It's going to ask for my password, which we've already set up, which I can just paste in like so. And now the schema is set up. So now what we can do is go back to our Docker Compose and reconfigure this now to work with Kestra. So let's now open Vim and Docker Compose. And now what we can do is get rid of this Postgres service, because we're not going to use that anymore. So what we can do now is just delete all of this, get rid of that from here. So now the only service in here will be the Kestra service. So now what we need to do is go down to the data sources here, and this is where we need to modify a few things. So the database username is now Postgres and the password is Kestra rocks. Now we just need to modify this address using the endpoint that we had available, which is this one. And because we've added that schema, /Kestra should exist. One last thing we need to do is now remove the depends on condition, because we're not depending on our Postgres database spinning up before Kestra does. So we can remove that as well. What we can do now is save this. So now we can do Docker Compose up and it's going to run just the Kestra image. We can then head back to Kestra and see that this is now going to run once it has spun up. We can see now Kestra is now running, but this time we've lost any data that we did have because that was in our previous database. We're now running using the RDS database. So that means there's only one step left, which is setting up S3 to run our internal storage. So next step is now to go to S3 and we're going to create a new bucket. let's do that now. So we can create bucket, and this is going to be Kestra AWS internal storage. I can now just scroll down to the bottom and press create. Now I've got my bucket already set up. So what I should go to now is IAM to be able to create a user that we can then authenticate with inside of the Kestra configuration. So let's create a new user and user group to be able to enable this. So I'm going to create a new user group, and this user group is going to be called Kestra AWS S3 access. I'm going to create my user group, and inside of my user group I need to attach a new user. Now that would be myself at the bottom here, so I'm going to add that here, and I also need to add the permission to give me full S3 access. So let's attach a policy and search S3, and we can see Amazon S3 full access is what I'm after. So what I'm going to do is now select that and I click attach policy. So now we've got the Amazon S3 full access, which is what we need to be able to connect to Kestra. To get your access key and your secret key, you can head over to security credentials in AWS, scroll down to get access keys, and here you can generate them. And then I can create a new access key. Now I'm going to select other and click next. And then I'm going to click create access key, and we're going to get our access key, which I'm going to hold on to, and then the secret key as well. So make sure you can make a copy of those and then press done. So now going back to the SSH terminal, I can turn off Kestra and go back to Vim. Now inside of the Docker Compose, there is our storage setting here, which is currently just set to local. We're going to now update this to be of type S3. We're going to then update this part to say S3. We're going to get rid of this part and add in our access key. I've got my access key and my secret key now. I need to add the region, which is EU West 2. And then I also need to add my bucket, which we can double check what that is by going back to S3. And we can then just double check what our bucket is called, which is AWS internal storage. So let's copy that and paste that in too. So now I've got my access key and my secret key set up. So now what I can do is save this, and then I can then spin up Docker again, and this time it's going to use S3. So what we've enabled here is we've got Kestra itself running on an EC2 instance. Our database is running in RDS, and the internal storage is running on S3. So now that Kestra is spinning up, we'll be able to refresh this page in just a second. And now if I was to go and generate a flow that's going to produce an output, I'm going to use the tutorial flow here to generate some output. So let's run this, and we're going to see that it's going to generate some data that will be put both in our database, but it will also be put inside of our internal storage. So we can see here we've already got a load of data in the outputs, including some files. So if I now go to Kestra's internal storage, we'll see that we've got a bucket here, and it's got the file processing execution, and we can see the outputs are generated for each task, and I can actually just go in there and see the CSV file exactly as I would expect. So this shows us that everything here is working, and we've got Kestra running with all of these different services. So now the only next step for you is to now get a domain name and set up HTTPS, as well as add some authentication. Check out in the description more information on all of that so that you can get your Kestra instance production ready. Hopefully you found that useful and you're going to install Kestra on AWS just like this. If you're interested to learn more, let us know in the comments below.